As an entry point into this project, I'd like to share with you brief glimpses of the 3 primary conditions that propel my political and intellectual work. Condition number 1. In 1990, Comanche activist and director of the Native American Women's Health Education Resource Center, Sharon Asatoyer, attempted to open a domestic violence shelter in Lake Andes, South Dakota. Asatoyer was immediately contacted by the city council and informed that she needed a zoning variance for the location the center had chosen for the shelter. As Lake Andes is disputed territory, that is, land not clearly defined as on or off the Yankton Sioux Indian Reservation as a result of centuries of federal policies aimed at diminishing and eroding native land holdings, Asatoyer was slightly concerned about the situation. Her apprehensions were not unwarranted, for during that meeting, Mike Whalen, the Deputy State's Attorney for South Dakota, himself assigned to protect victims of crime, argued against opening a shelter that would primarily serve Native women in Lake Andes. He said, and I quote, "Indian culture as I view it is presently so mongrelized as to be a mix of dependency on the federal government and a primitive society, wholly on the outside of the mainstream of Western civilization and thought. The Native American culture as we know it now, not as it formerly existed, is a culture of hopelessness, godlessness, of joblessness, and lawlessness." Needless to say, the Resource Center was denied the zoning permit. Condition number 2. Violent crime victimization for Native women is higher than for all other populations in the United States. 1 out of every 3 Native women will be raped in their lifetimes. 3 out of every 4 Native women will be physically assaulted. Native women are stalked at a rate more than double that of any other population. And during the period 1979 through 1992, homicide was the 3rd leading cause of death of Native females aged 15 to 34. Violence against Native women is a problem of epic proportions that not only endangers the lives of individual Native women, but also erodes the sovereignty of Native nations and destroys Native communities both on and off reservation. Condition number 3. As I more officially began the academic project of interrogating the problem of violence against Native women when I began my graduate studies at UCLA in 2006, and came to the work that developed into my American Indian Studies master's thesis in 2007, critical and sometimes crisis-inducing questions about my own relationship to violence, Native communities, reservation borders, and urban spaces surfaced. How could I, an urban mixed-blood Indian, whose personal creation story begins not with a hollow log, a mound of clay, a turtleback, or the clearing of the fog to reveal my animal clan, but rather with the pain, terror, and violence that accompanies alcoholism, drug addiction, sexual assault, and domestic abuse, articulate any sort of understanding or relationship to Native tradition? How could I, a rather textbook illustration of the consequences of colonization, such as assimilation, relocation, abandonment, internalized racism, violence, and historical trauma, express a worldview or initiate a research project that could be described as Native as opposed to anything else? Granted, when I ran into my homeless Muscogee grandfather on the streets of Stockton, California for the first time a couple of summers ago, I was looking for tradition and a Native homecoming. But what I found were stories of prison, incest, murder, abuse, and poverty. These realities don't mesh well with the bona fide and more authentic Indian persona I often find myself wrestling with and longing after in dreams of identity and inclusion. Fortunately, I refused to allow these constraints to stifle my energies, and instead I pushed forward, initiating academic and political projects that fuse together the multifaceted conditions I have briefly described for you. From the very beginning of my efforts to end violence against Native women, I have been committed to exploring the ways in which urban Indian women in the United States in particular are located within this phenomenon. With over 60% of Native peoples living in urban areas, and with Los Angeles having the largest population of urban Indians in a major metropolitan center, I find it both startling and worthy of investigation that there are no shelters that serve Native women or have culturally competent services for Indian women within Los Angeles. Furthermore, there is relatively little research on violence against Native women within the urban communities in the United States. Thus, as I first began the work on my master's thesis in 2007, I imagined it as a small portion of a dissertation project in which I would learn from various models of indigenous resistance to gender violence across Indian country in order to bring those models home to the Native women I have worked with in Los Angeles. From here, I hope to have dialogues about how we might utilize and or reconceptualize portions of these reservation-based models to work for us in the LA area. So I embarked on that project, and I conducted approximately 72 hours of interviews with Native activists instrumental in the birth and growth of the South Dakota Coalition Against Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault. I spent hours visiting with elders in their homes, their work sites, their communities, and I eventually collaboratively produced a case history that documents critical moments, locations, and events in Native women's mobilization efforts against violence. By centering the voices and concerns of these women, and accordingly, by decentering the mainstream colonialist narrative that typically narrates such historical events, I was able to glean insights from perspectives generally marginalized and trivialized. Throughout my time working with my Native aunties in South Dakota, however, I often found myself having conversation after conversation about the tragedy that urban Indian women also face staggering rates of violence, but that ultimately these women should return to their respective Native nations, read reservations, if they really want help from their communities. Otherwise, I was instructed, they shouldn't truly expect to seek justice as Native women because the U.S. does not have an obligation to individual Native peoples, but rather to sovereign Native nations. If these women have quote-unquote chosen to leave their reservations or their nations, then they must fight violence as women of color, not as Native women per se. The policing of Native women's identity implicit in these arguments astounded me. But more than that, they broke my heart, because these sentiments were not espoused by the state. They were spoken by women who respected my work, women who invited me into their homes, trusted me with some of the most difficult work they'd done in their lives, loved me as a relative, and yet would, in the end, argue that I'd chosen to leave or not return to a community in Oklahoma that 2 generations of violent men in my family had essentially alienated me from. Ultimately then, this argument goes, I do not deserve the same sort of protection from violence that Indian women on the reservation deserve. Additionally, these rigid and limiting conceptualizations of the bodies that constitute Native nations and their geographic locations in the U.S. immediately reminded me of the all-consuming panic and self-doubt I had associated with articulating my own location within the Muscogee Nation and Native communities before I had begun to take seriously the possibilities of re-articulating Native experiences beyond static, ahistoricized romanticizations of an original and traditional Indian somehow positioned outside the colonial experience. Informed by critical moments such as these, I now recognize that the absence of urban Native women from discussions of violence against Native women both inside and outside the academy is not simply an oversight, but has to do directly with the ways in which gendered urban Native identity has been constructed. And as Cherokee scholar activist Andrea Smith reminds us, colonization has been and continues to be a gendered process. More pointedly, as Native scholars like Smith and Inez Hernandez Avila argue, the U.S. settler state has conceptualized Native women as a threat to the U.S. body politic since the earliest moments of colonization, in particular because of their abilities to reproduce Native peoples, Native communities, and by extension, Native claims to land. Urban Native women, then, incite an enhanced sort of settler state panic because, in addition, they upset the colonial dream that Dakota Sioux scholar Phil Deloria argues underpinned the creation of the reservation system that attempts to contain and manage Indian peoples in spaces that are able to be carefully surveilled and controlled. the epidemic of violence targeted toward Native women, and then the restriction of state-controlled resources to reservation-based programs evidence these arguments. However, also critical to my work are the ways in which Native nations have too constructed urban Native women as a threat to the state. And here I'm referring to the Native state. For example, when Native nationalists, or Native activists for that matter, rely on definitions of Nativeness that are steeped in colonialist discourse and reify binaries such as reservation urban, which Seneca scholar Nashana Goman reminds us are themselves colonial constructs, urban Native women become conceptualized as somehow less authentically and less legitimately Native women. Furthermore, these urban Native women are not simply constructed then as superfluous to the authentic Native nation, but again become configured as a threat to an otherwise more pure and healthy Native body politic. In Foucauldian terms then, urban Native women are constructed as the biological threat, or that which has the potential to contaminate through reproduction, the thinning of Indian blood, the loss of Indian culture and tradition, etc. The loss of Indian culture and tradition, etc., the authentic, or read federally recognized Native nation. In conclusion then, my project now moves far beyond attempting to bring resources to urban Indian women who face violence in the Los Angeles area. It goes beyond attempting to understand our experiences and locations as victims of colonization and state-inflicted violence, as well as personal violence. It goes beyond debating whether we have more access to economic resources if we identify as women of color or as Native women entitled to Title IX monies under the Violence Against Women Act. It even reaches further than attempting to initiate more honest dialogue and alliances between urban and reservation Native women. All of these political projects are important to the survival of Native women in urban settings, and I do plan to address them at some level in my research. However, I now recognize that eradicating violence against urban Native women must emerge from a much more radical analysis that challenges the very assumptions in my previous work. In rethinking these colonial gender dynamics, my analysis must concern itself with the very ways in which urban Native women have become simultaneously marked as enemies of the state and marginalized as subjects existing beyond state protection. It must consider how the identities of urban Native women have been crafted by various parties in ways that perpetuate that violence. Furthermore, it must consider the ways in which alternative conceptualizations, or perhaps more precisely, deconstructions of urban Native identity, have the potential to explode the very foundations of colonialism, power, and domination. Mudo.